There's an undeniable art to movie Easter eggs. Audiences love to seek them out for their cleverness and ingenuity, often serving as a reward for keen-eyed, attentive viewers. More often than not, Easter eggs are a playful tip of the hat to observant audience members, perhaps containing a sly nod to a wider aspect of the series' lore, or simply including a cute message acknowledging that the viewer is paying attention. But every now and then, a filmmaker will sneak a secret into their film that's a little more nefarious, perhaps even genuinely mean-spirited. So I am Gareth, this is What Culture, and here are the most spiteful movie Easter eggs ever. Project Mayhem destroys Alien on VHS Fight Club. Now, it's no secret that David Fincher had an absolutely hellish time working on his feature debut that was Alien 3, with executive meddling resulting in a messy, if intriguing, end product that he still disowns to this very day. But Fincher seemingly could not resist getting some petty revenge while shooting Fight Club. In the montage of Project Mayhem's soldiers carrying out their various missions of criminal mischief, some of them are seen demagnetizing all the videotapes in a rental store. If you look closely, one of the rows of VHS tapes is filled with copies of Ridley Scott's original Alien. Presumably, the rental store they shot the scene in didn't have any copies of Alien 3 lingering around, so Fincher had to settle for Scott's film, which, in the casual sense, actually led to Fincher's misfire of a directorial debut, if you think about it, before anyone considers this a mere coincidence. Remember that Fincher is one of the most detail-orientated filmmakers working today. If something is up front in the frame, he definitely meant it to be there. Now, I've got a quick question for you. What is a fascinating Easter egg that you think more people need to know about? Well, you let me know all about them in the comment section right down below. Siskel and Ebert are aliens. They live. Plenty of directors have taken blatant pot shots at film critics for negative reviews they've given previously. Though one of the more hilariously subtle put-downs occurs in John Carpenter's They Live. Carpenter's brilliantly unhinged sci-fi satire revolves around a drifter, Nada, who learns that the ruling class are in fact aliens with skeletal faces, who are transmitting a signal to keep the human race pacified and unaware of this fact. In the film's climax, when Nada destroys the signal and the aliens' true identities are revealed, a montage shows various aliens being outed for who they really are. This includes two slightly familiar-looking aliens on TV talking about the excessive violence in the movies of Carpenter and George A. Romero, with a placard behind them that reads, "No independent thought." It's easily missed, but these aliens are actually supposed to be film critics Gene Siskel and Roger Ebert, neither of whom had showed much love to Carpenter's more recent films at the time. Even if you don't recognize Siskel's distinctive suit or Ebert's hair-glasses combo, Siskel's nasal voice as he talks about Carpenter and Romero is a dead giveaway. It may be funny, but it's also clearly the work of a frustrated filmmaker keen to vent that the two most famous film critics on the planet won't stop trashing his output. He clearly wasn't happy. Bryan Singer calls X-Men The Last Stand the worst X-Men Apocalypse. Halfway through X-Men Apocalypse, Jean Grey and several other mutants go to see Star Wars Return of the Jedi at the cinema, only to emerge disappointed that it didn't quite live up to the brilliance of The Empire Strikes Back. As they debate the film's merits, the scene ends with Jean knowingly quipping, "Well, at least we can all agree that the third one is always the worst." If to the casual observer this might seem like a general joke about the tendency for movie threequels to disappoint, it's really a more pointed stab at the third X-Men movie, The Last Stand. After shooting the first two X-Men movies, Apocalypse director Bryan Singer ended up stepping away from the third, which was ultimately helmed by Brett Ratner, to a wildly indifferent response from fans and critics alike. Given that Singer essentially used the film before Apocalypse, X-Men Days of Future Past, to undo everything he didn't like about The Last Stand, he evidently still had a chip on his shoulder about what went down. The irony, of course, is that Apocalypse itself ended up being a colossal disappointment, and because it's the third of the X-Men prequel movies, the joke applies to itself also, resulting in a bit of a self-own. And considering that both The Last Stand and Apocalypse were written by Simon Kinberg, there's something weirdly poetic about that. Alec Trevelyan was named after a British censor who hated Bond movies, GoldenEye. The villain of GoldenEye is of course revealed to be James Bond's former ally 006, aka Alec Trevelyan. Because the film wasn't based on any existing Ian Fleming story, the villain's memorable name was instead dreamt up by the filmmakers themselves, the origins of which are hilariously savage. So as it turns out, the name Alec Trevelyan was inspired by John Trevelyan, who served as secretary of the British Board of Film Censors from 1958 to 1971. Throughout his career, Trevelyan was known as a strict censor, particularly on major commercial films, and had a marked distaste for the earlier Bond films, referring to their callous sadism in his 1973 autobiography, What the Censor Saw. He did not like himself some 007. And so, as a measure of snide payback against Trevelyan, who in fairness died way back in 1986, his name was co-opted by GoldenEye's villain, who you could say is himself a rather callous sadist, no? Eddie Van Halen trolls his own bandmates Back to the Future. Few who've seen Back to the Future will ever forget the scene where Marty masquerades as Darth Vader and blasts loud rock music at his father George in order to wake him up and convince him to ask Lorraine out. You probably noticed that the cassette Marty inserts into the Walkman is labelled Van Halen, but considering the label is only on screen for around a second, you might have missed that the word Edward precedes it in much smaller type. There's an entire backstory behind this. Basically, the filmmakers wanted to use Van Halen's music for the scene, but when all the band members except for Eddie Van Halen himself refused, well, they had to get creative. Because Eddie Van Halen had previously recorded music for another Universal film released the year prior, The Wildlife, some of those compositions were simply reused here as imitation Van Halen music. Very clever. But because neither the rest of the band nor the record label had given permission for Van Halen's brand to be invoked, the cassette couldn't simply say Van Halen. Yet, given that Eddie Van Halen's real name was Edward Van Halen, director Robert Zemeckis was able to get away with the name drop by including the musician's full name on the label. As we all know, being technically correct is always the best kind of correct. The dog chews on a Godzilla toy because Godzilla was the movie's box office rival, Armageddon. Michael Bay has never been one to mince words or actions, and was well aware that his 1998 disaster flick Armageddon faced intense competition in the blockbuster sphere, given that it was releasing mere weeks after both Deep Impact and Roland Emmerich's Godzilla. Nevertheless, Bay forged ahead and decided to throw the gauntlet down to the King of the Monsters in an amusing way, by opening his film with a fleeting glimpse of a bike messenger's dog grabbing a Godzilla toy in its mouth, and also attacking an inflatable Godzilla. How mature. The implication, of course, being that Godzilla could be bested by a tiny, harmless puppy. It's all in the spirit of competition at the end of the day, but Bay clearly wanted to let Emmerich know, I'm coming for your wig. And Bay's cockiness turned out to be well-founded too, as Armageddon not only outgrossed both aforementioned movies by a massive margin, but ended up the highest-grossing film of 1998. Say that, Zilla. A film critic is murdered who resembles a real film critic who hated Dirty Harry. The Deadpool. The fifth and final film in the Dirty Harry series sees Harry Callahan pursuing a twisted serial killer who murders celebrities in order to manipulate a Deadpool game. One of the killer's victims is a high-profile San Francisco film critic by the name of Molly Fisher. And given that much of the film is centered around Hollywood and filmmaking, the presence of such a character isn't at all out of place. However, Fisher is actually a stand-in for real-life film critic Pauline Kael, who was similarly a famous San Francisco film reviewer and to whom Fisher bears a strong physical resemblance. Kael had previously criticized the original Dirty Harry as a fascist movie, and panned the other films in the series. So the decision was made to write a proxy of Kael into the franchise's final installment. While most other movies on this list were a little more playful with their mockery, the Deadpool actually kills Fisher off in a grimly protracted scene, where the killer tells her, a critic with a heart, that's a laugh. This naturally flew right over the head of most popcorn-gobbling audiences at the time. though it's actually an incredibly mean thumbing of the nose at someone who committed the crime of just disliking a movie. It's very cruel. Everything about Lord Farquaad is a slight against former Disney CEO Michael Eisner, Shrek. While the film as a whole is primarily a parody of fairy tales and Disney animation, there is a more pointed, prodding layer of satire tucked beneath the surface in Shrek. The film's antagonist, Lord Farquaad, is widely believed to be inspired by then Disney CEO Michael Eisner, who forced Shrek producer Jeffrey Katzenberg to resign as Disney's chairman in 1994. Katzenberg responded by accepting a massive $250 million payoff and founding DreamWorks Pictures mere weeks later, after which he set his sights on finally bringing Shrek to the big screen. Beyond the obvious satire of Disney tropes, the film's presentation of Farquaad is clearly intended to rankle Eisner. For starters, both men preside over a magical kingdom of sorts. Farquaad's facial features are not dissimilar to those of Eisner, and Farquaad's diminutive stature is likely a riff on Eisner's alleged mocking of Katzenberg's height in real life. This game of tit-for-tat saw Disney refuse to air commercials for Shrek on Radio Disney, before DreamWorks released Shrek on home video the same day as Disney's Monsters, Inc., and Shrek then went on to beat it for the Best Animated Film Oscar. At the end of the day, it's a case of one obscenely rich person slinging mud at another obscenely rich person. But if you thought immense wealth might make a person, I don't know, a little less petty, clearly that's not the case at all. Patton Oswalt takes another opportunity to dunk on Star Wars 22 Jump Street. 22 Jump Street is full of hilarious blink and you'll miss it gags, and the cattiest of all surely appears during Patton Oswalt's cameo as a college history professor. While he's talking, focus your eyes on the chalkboard behind him, and you might notice a heading which reads Failed American Policy, under which it lists drug war, the war on terror, wars in general, Cold War, culture wars, and Star Wars. While at face value the history professor is presumably referring to Star Wars in terms of Ronald Reagan's proposed 1980s missile defense system, which was nicknamed the Star Wars program, looking a little bit closer reveals something else entirely. Next to Star Wars, the word Prequels is faintly scrawled in parentheses, clearly referring to George Lucas' much-maligned trilogy of Star Wars prequels. It is an especially amusing Easter egg given Patton Oswalt's involvement, considering that the year prior he made a famous cameo appearance in Parks and Recreation, which was largely devoted to him outlining a ridiculous fan theory for Star Wars The Force Awakens. Better still, 22 Jump Street directors Phil Lord and Chris Miller were even hired a few years later to direct Solo, a Star Wars story, though they were ultimately fired mid-production due to their improv-heavy filmmaking style, and replaced with Ron Howard. Hitchcock made the villain resemble meddling producer David O. Selznick, Rear Window. It is quite the understatement to say that Alfred Hitchcock wasn't too fond of mega-producer David O. Selznick, for despite teaming up on the beloved likes of Rebecca, Notorious, and Spellbound, they frequently butted heads creatively. Selznick was a forthright mile-a-minute producer, while Hitch was a more quiet, reserved artist, resulting in the two clashing as Hitch felt that Selznick excessively asserted himself on his movie sets. After later cutting ties with Selznick, Hitch decided to have some fun at his expense by conceiving the villain of his 1954 masterpiece Rear Window, murderer Lars Thorwald, to bear a striking resemblance to the producer. Actor Raymond Burr, who was actually just 36 years of age at the time of filming, was given a voluminous mane of hair, distinctive eyeglasses, and tailored suit to resemble Selznick, who was himself 51 years old when Rear Window was being shot. Furthermore, Hitchcock allegedly coached Burr on the producer's mannerisms, from his posture and how he carried himself, to even the way he held a telephone. Though it's as easily missed today as it was by viewers of the era, it's nothing if not a savage feat of revenge by one of the greatest filmmakers there ever was. A masterful bit of trolling.